on contract valuations, the impacts of climate change. And we can do that now. And if we did that now, the return on investment which people will calculate will be very different. Now, you all know, if you're in accounting, that provisions are very subjective. And you can use lots of different assumptions to where you get to. But if we come up with assumptions which form some form of reality of the future, then maybe some of those changes, behavioral changes, might happen now.
Thank you. I want 2 points very quickly, if I may, Leon, that I want to touch on. The first one was your reference to benchmarks. Are you finding that is more challenging and you need different benchmarks for maybe Global South? And we know using that for a collective for kind of emerging markets, even high carbon intensive economies and things like that. How are you looking at that from a benchmark perspective?
So when I talk about a benchmark, it's somewhat investment management focused. So often our mandates are to perform relative to a benchmark. So if we're in emerging markets, it would be against an emerging markets benchmark, be it MSCI or Russell and the like. So it just gives us a framing on how well our portfolio is doing relative to that benchmark.
Okay, I see. So that's the aggregate on the market level, not necessarily, for example, a carbon intensity benchmark.
No, not necessarily the carbon intensity benchmark. But if I'm looking at a specific company, I'll be looking to quote-unquote benchmark that relative to peers in the sector, and I'll try and get as close as possible to different peers. Why will I do that? Because I want to understand what the differences are, and then when I go and see the company, I can say, why are you higher than this peer? What's going on here? What can you do about that?
Yeah. And on the engagement element, I mean, on that, of course, you know, is one of those, the strategies in responsible investment, obviously, is that your biggest lever probably sits in engagement. And are you finding different ways in which you might need to engage with Global South, or are there perhaps other principles you might apply in relation to that?
So a lot of it depends on the relationship you have with the company, and it's not climate specific. So in the UK, I pick up the phone, I can see the chair of the company next week, more or less. If I go to China or another emerging market, it's much more difficult to get into the boardroom at all. So it's a little bit about access, and then it's how you influence. Because let's face it, we might have 1% of the company. So you know, we don't say jump and then they say how high. It's not going to happen that way. So you have different ways of influencing, and part of it will depend on where other investors are, but partly it's also about trying to align the interests of the different stakeholders, so the board with investors, and also pointing out what might happen in the future should they not take a specific approach. So it's the amount of influence you might have in a particular company.
Thank you for that, Leon. I think those were useful insights, especially if you're a company, on how an investor's thinking about you and what they're looking at. So we've spoken about PwC, other people have spoken about you, Lulu. We have to. So PwC, so Lulu Kuchel is PwC, and you'll do an introduction of yourself as well. You're both an expert on ESG and an auditor of non-financial data. Disclosure regulations and frameworks are growing. You know, we're thinking about all the acronyms we can find: IWSB, CSRD, BSR in India. What patterns are you seeing in terms of ESG disclosure regulation? And I think, you know, a little bit about the global picture, and where does this leave companies that are on an early journey to their ESG?
Sure, there's a lot of things packed into that question, and some of the other comments that came earlier. Leon, I actually want to just before I jump into that, maybe let me start with a quick introduction before I jump into all of the comments. So I'm Lulu Krugel. I'm the head of sustainability for PwC Africa. I'm just going to confess, I'm not an accountant, I'm an economist. So it is an interesting journey for me. And the point that you made, I think I challenge my colleagues about this very often, to say that we are in a position to actually drive a lot of what is happening through our actions. And to your point and to your point, I do not think that in a lot of the big four accounting firms, there's broad understanding by everybody in the accounting space of some of these issues. It is still groups of people, groups of individuals. So as PwC, one of our key drivers has been to say, how do we upskill and train up all of our accountants to understand this better, so that, you know, they don't have to rely on just a small group of people every time that we get these challenges and issues. And if we are involved in the financial accounting of a client, then there's an opportunity to better understand the risks that they are facing. If I just, and being an economist, my first foray into accounting standards was around IFRS 9, you know, and looking at the economic challenges and how do we build that into making you know, or getting views on defaults and et cetera that might be coming through. So for me, that's really been a big driver, to say, how do we upskill our entire workforce to understand all of the accountants? We probably have one of the biggest groups of people that can influence what is happening in this space, to your point and to your point. So what have we seen? I think one of the key things that we are driving from a global perspective as PwC is standardization, making things easier and standardization, but at the same point, also that understanding that everybody is not in the same space. Everybody is not starting from the same base. So when we engage with our clients, especially the larger ones that are listed, I've seen a massive shift, and I'm actually very glad to see that over the last couple of years, where companies have actually been in a space where they say, well, if you're not complying, I'm moving on. To Lashni's point earlier, we've seen a lot of companies saying, I cannot do that. I understand, especially in our developing markets and coming from South Africa, that we cannot do that. We want to take our suppliers on a journey as companies. So I think that's a very big focus. Secondly is, we had a conversation earlier, myself and Pranya as well, around starting somewhere, getting that fear factor removed from the conversations. So very importantly, as you said, data is a challenge. Information is a massive challenge. But what we're trying to help companies with is just understand where the pain points are, so that they can start engaging with the suppliers in their supply chain and can start supporting them in a way, not come down on them one day and say, this is what we expect you to do. So starting on that journey, and you know, removing the fear factor, be it through training. We've had lots of clients say to us, help us train the companies that are in our supply chain. How can we help them? And then the other very, very important factor that we're also seeing is data availability, data management systems. And here I don't know if I'm speaking to anybody in the room here, but I want to make a very big plea. I still switch on. Okay. I want to make a very big plea to everybody that's working with the technology and data side in organizations, to say, please engage with the sustainability teams, please engage with the business, understand what the needs are, because you know, the data and technology people get incredibly excited about new technologies and things that are coming in, you know, and these guys are doing this, and we can measure this, and we can measure that, without going back to the business and understanding what the business needs really are. Getting all the stakeholders around the table, speaking to everybody that needs information, you know, and I'm talking broader ESG and carbon accounting here, that needs information. What format do they need it in? When do they need it? What is really important and, you know, material for what we're trying to achieve? Instead of just investing in new infrastructure and systems, and then it doesn't fit the need of what is required, and everybody gets completely freaked out that needs to work with it. So really start talking to the sustainability team, start understanding the needs in the business before investing in any new technology or infrastructure. So yeah, data, training, training people, removing that fear factor. We spoke about that earlier. Bringing your supply chain along, just understanding where the biggest pain points are. I spoke to Prajna earlier as well, and I think it's maybe my economist thinking that's coming through here, but there are a couple of initiatives that's happening from the academic side, economists in particular, that's saying, you've done a lot of work to understand what is happening with jobs, what is happening with GDP. We're actually in a good position to help understand what is happening, because we map and understand supply chains, what is happening with carbon emissions. So there's an organization that's at one of the universities called GTAP that make carbon emissions data available for a lot of countries globally. It's a starting point. I'm not gonna, maybe they should speak to the SBTI as well, but it's a starting point to just get the conversation going and understand maybe where the hotspots are in developing markets. But I agree, I think it's more industry driven than country driven specifically. I said a lot. I know.
But a lot of very useful insights, I think, in terms of what to do and where to start. And those are applicable regardless of the size of the company. Yeah. And so just more complexity, but I think good guidance on how to help navigate that complexity well. But also great segue then, Leah, to you. So Terrascope, and you can tell us a little about Terrascope, but, you know, and part of all of this, of course, costs are always a concern, as we've now highlighted, and they can be a significant barrier to carbon accounting and setting science-based targets, especially for smaller companies. You've got all of this, consultants, tools, audit fees, everything. How do you see this developing, and is there, you know, your platform perhaps adding to some of the solutions we need in what sounds like the need for a democratization of carbon accounting?
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having Terrascope join today. Wonderful to be here. Terrascope does need an introduction in this crowd. So we are a SaaS platform that focuses on carbon accounting and the decarbonization journey. And by the way, I love a good carbon accounting conversation before 10 a.m. This is what I live for. So I'm deep in it. So we are a corporate-backed venture by Olam, which is a Fortune 500 agricultural commodity player, and BCGX incubated with Olam. And so needless to say, we focus on large enterprises, the SaaS, which is a lot of data security and confidentiality. We really invest in that. And the food and agricultural value chain and adjacencies. So those are industries with a lot of land exposure, and actually the flag guidance from SBTI has been a big business model consideration for us, because if it was complicated before having one inventory, if you have land sector exposure, you now need 2 different emissions inventories. And what that's doing is really changing the downstream players to understand their upstream, especially smallholder farmer exposure of emissions. And it's creating, if we talk about emerging markets, a lot of the supply chains start there. And so there's actually tremendous decarbonization investment potential that's now changing the conversation. So it's a really exciting time. I want to talk a little bit about just the kind of data, the democratization of data. So our purpose as a company is to empower enterprises to keep the planet habitable. And so that we empower enterprises by making data available. I mean, and it's really about embedding. So what does that look like in practice? It's one platform, everyone in the company can sign on, see their business unit, see what the emissions are, scope 1, 2, and 3 of that business unit. So it goes all the way down to structuring. And having that single source of truth to sign on and see where the emissions is. So the space is changing, where the technology is moving from annual inventory to some of our clients want quarterly emissions updates. So much more real time. Integration with API. So we talked about upstream emissions with smallholders. We want to make it really easy for suppliers. If we just know their geolocation, then we can look at satellite data. So we don't need to ask them, what is your land use and deforestation year? We can just get that satellite data. So there's a lot of interesting data ecosystem developments happening. The second one is looking at the investment versus a cost. So if we're only looking at carbon accounting as a cost, the real cost is going to come in the decarbonization journey itself. And actually, it's scary to think about all of that investment without a good, solid basis of that data available.
No, thank you. And I think you've given us really good insight about that. But what I have to contain myself, because it's exceptionally exciting when we consider the more recent developments. Well, not development. It shouldn't be a recent development, right? Because it's one and the same. But on nature-based and nature-based disclosures now, and looking at those sorts of things. So actually, what you're doing in mapping terrain and all of that is going to be directly relevant in understanding one nature footprint in its entirety. And then I think hopefully also the balancing of carbon sinks versus mitigation. And those are, I think, hopefully, I'm making it up here, but I think useful other adjacents for that technology and the ability to do that.
Yeah, very quickly on that point,
Yeah.
it's there's the water,
Yeah.
so specialization in the space and
Yeah.
really having more of an industry focus is absolutely where this direction is going, and I think that's the evolution in the market. Talking about integration with audit and assurance platforms can really help streamline that process. And yeah, I mean, it's going through a tremendous tremendous evolution, yeah.
An exciting one too. And okay, so we're almost at the end, but I'd also like to invite our new panelist, Pavilion, who's from the Confederation of Indian Industry. And of course, a lot happening in India, right? You have regulations around reporting for your top market cap 250 companies in the country. And what are you finding, Pravir, some of the opportunities, but also the challenges just in being able to meet those requirements, and in particular, the carbon accounting?
So I think, so I will start with the standards. I think most of the standards or the emission factors, they are more focused or developed based on the European data or US data. And again, I think if a global south or specific to India, we have a different processes even for the agriculture, even cement and steels and all these things. So the processes are totally different. Farming practices are in a different way. And again, I think animal husbandry is also different because we use animal products in a different way. Rather than the Europe and all these things. So I think that local factor needs to be integrated very well. That will definitely give you a clear picture what is happening with the companies. And I will give you a simple example which we are recently doing. We are doing carbon accounting for the turmeric production for 2 different companies. And it's the same process. So processes are different, but the finished product is same. And emission factors are also different. So again, that happens because one is sourcing from nearby area, another is sourcing from different area. Their processing locations are different, the transportation changes and all these things. So when you are going into deep into these things, then they will understand that really what is the challenges is happening, the farmers, how the farmers are doing practices. So in some of the areas, use of fertilizers and pesticides is more, but in the another area where the requirement is less. And that's actually impacting the emission factors or the overall carbon emission from the turmeric or curcumin production. I think that needs to be integrated very well. I think another point is highlighted that how the industry association can be a part of this assessment is because what we have seen that we last year we started a product called EcoAge where we are actually asking big companies to join participate as a EcoAge and work their supply chain for definitely for ESG and carbon assessment. When the company is directly connecting them with their suppliers and asking that data, the data is not flowing very well because there are challenges that how they will be using. Similar suppliers or MSMEs is actually giving products to their competitors and all these things, so they didn't want to disclose that thing. But when they are going through CII, through EcoAge and all these things, the acceptability is much higher. And again, we are not directly sending them a format. So we are starting with awareness creations, that what we need from you. And we also customize the questionnaires in a very simple way. So for GHG accounting, we are just asking 10 questions to MSMEs. That what is your electricity requirement? What is your raw product? Where it is coming? Did you know who is actually supplying to you? And then if you are able to share their contact details, then we will connect them separately. So what is happening now, so that he knows that I just have to provide these 10 data. We also given them an option that for the distance that you have traveled, you have a truck bills or transportation bills? Can you put the kilometers from directly there? And what is happening, so we have a separate MSME toolkit, which is very simple, 10 questions. They are putting themselves the data. We are not using it. Till they say that we need your support, then we are using it. Otherwise, they can download the report on their own. So I think that type system is important, and I think somebody has definitely highlighted that how industry association can be pitch in. I think that's the way industry association can be pitch in, because they feel that this is a transparent mechanism. They are member of it. They can pressurize us, or they can also take the benefit. I think that might be a mechanism which will enhance the more data collections, and again customizing the standards. I think that might be a very critical requirement, because I think now ISO 14064 is very widely accepted in India. Most of the businesses are following, but again we do face challenges in the emission factors. I think similar emission factor is on the fertilizer production. So the variation is around 15 to 50%. So I'm not able to put that emission factor in the calculations, and SBTi do talk about when you are calculating any agriculture product emissions, you have to integrate that chemical fertilizer input. But again, this variation is actually huge for the companies, and the emission has suddenly increased 15 times. So I think that these are some of the challenges. If we can work on this thing, I think companies will be able to get their supply chain. And I think very important part is the climate vulnerability part. I still feel the GHG emission is very easy to calculate if we ask them the right questions. But again, what is happening because of the climate change to them, how their cost will increase, how their GHG emission will increase, I think that factor is still not in a decision making for the industry, and that actually limiting the future planning also. Right. And I think that is clearly visible because now lots of companies, so for example, recently you have seen floods in Chennai. Right now there is also flood. Most of the automotive sector hub is there. So all major companies are producing their vehicles there. Now what they are planning that they want to shift their future expansions in other states, other areas. So that is a huge cost. This is again climate vulnerability, but that might also increase MSME's vulnerability to transport that material to that new area. So I think this is what you, now I think the data integration is very important, and I think that should be communicated to the industry very well.
Thank you. Thanks, Praveen. I think you've given us a really great look through from the granular of the emissions factor variability right up to understanding the risks on actually a macroeconomic level. Because if you're looking at relocating entire industries and their supply chain, I mean, that is a massive shift and a cost to the economy that, but as you also pointed out, is not easily understood sometimes for businesses unless they're facing it directly. And thank you. And I think the role then of the industry associations in creating trust and, kind of united platforms is an important one. It sounds like it's good in the local context, right? Because who else is going to understand local context better than the local kind of business associations? So let me then wrap up, Pragya. We'll come back to you, our host today. So you've got extensive experience with managing GHG accounting and reporting across a variety of operating contexts. I mean, Process operates across the world. What have you learned from this experience, and what do you see as necessary development to increase uptake of climate action in emerging markets?
Thank you so much. It's been an amazingly interesting. I would have loved to have you all over for dinner and we continue the conversation. I wish I'd planned it better, but certainly this will continue. I know we have very little time, so I'm going to say this very quickly, and a lot of you have heard me say this before for sure. I'm going to give you a very practical example. We have set our science-based targets. We have had them verified. It took us about 9 months to get to the verification. We actually had to work with you, learn together with your team to actually think a little bit out of the box or allow for a little bit out of the box contextualization. And I have a fantastic team around here. Ronel has been doing carbon accounting for the company from far before I was there, and has been, from the time when we did not get limited assurance, but has been a firm believer. And here we are with Scope 3 across the board, across all of our portfolio companies. They have it's a mandatory requirement for them. So I had a bit of a shock this year, and it was a bit of an awakening for me. I was looking at, we're an investor. We invest in multiple different types of business models across emerging market context. And there were two inventories in front of me of exactly the same business model. One of them, I'm going to say it is in South Africa. The other one is in Europe. And we own both businesses, controlling interests, and therefore we can get their data. And I was shocked that the one that was in Europe actually has a much smaller physical footprint. A much larger physical footprint with more distribution centers, vehicles on their fleet, and all of that. While the one in South Africa had a smaller physical footprint, but their emissions were, the one in South Africa was much higher. And then I started chatting with the team and I said, but that's not fair. We've set our science-based targets, which means all of our portfolio companies, and our target is to have a majority of our portfolio companies set their target by 2030. And they're all in emerging economies. So when I asked them to set a target, first, in that marathon race, they're already starting way behind because the emission factors of the country is already putting them at a wrong foot. Plus, they do not have the same access to capital, infrastructure, enabling policy, historical economic stability. I've just set them up for disaster. And that does not make me feel good. I then started doing some research. I have a Greenpeace background. I apologize for that. So, I went activist on the activists a bit. And we did a bit of research into who is reporting on CDP. You said CDP has feet on the ground. Unfortunately, majority of those feet are in the global north. Who are the ones that are scoring above B+ on CDP? Majority reporters are, again, from the global north. So, and where is the resource allocation in terms of human capital, office space? Again, global north. We actually had I apologize, Amir is not here, but we had a very frank conversation with the CDP team on saying, you know what, we've committed ourselves. It's very, very selfish. We've committed ourselves to ISBTIs. We want to reach them. To be able to reach them, we need you to turn your face a little bit, because it's not about one size fits all, but who is it fitting? Who is that size fitting? And unfortunately, that size is really just fitting the global north. We have to find, I would love for the CII team, for example, to work with your teams. Absolutely. And the NBI team, if that is possible, because there has to be some regional adaptation. It's not fair for my South African entity to have a smaller physical footprint, but have to be starting at such a disadvantage when they're an uphill task in every which way. So if we really need to, if we mean this about, it's going to be real, we have to all get into this together. We really have to find really practical and real. Sorry, I keep staring at you. I apologize. I'm so happy you're here, Tracy. Yes, which is why I think that was the ethos for this session. I'm very grateful. Thanks, Sharila.
Thank you, Pragya. And thank you again to all our panelists who've joined us today and for your patience as we ran a little bit over. But I think what is amazing conversation. And again, Pragya, thank you to you, Ronel Process team, for making it possible, because we don't have these conversations enough, and certainly not in this kind of setting. So it's very useful in just shifting our minds and also, I think, finding where the solutions can come from. So thank you very much, everybody.